we became aware that there was some sort of an outbreak.
The Wuhan Institute of Virology was the center point.
And may have been a deliberately made construct.
The lab escape version is so freaking likely.
One way or the other, it came out of Wuhan.
The logical next step is whether the US contributed to this pandemic starting.
Researchers in the Chinese government were on US government payroll.
The consequences are enormous. No accident like this has ever happened in human history.
Scientific debate about the origins of COVID was actively suppressed. One's tempted to use the word conspiracy.
The true origins of COVID-19 have been the subject of intense scrutiny and debate. Scientists, government officials, and intelligence agencies at first insisted the virus was natural. Now, more than 3 years on, their cover-ups are being exposed. Key figures are calling out their deception, and they don't like it.
I wake up at usually about 2 or 3 a.m. and think about it, honestly, because, you know, it's something that we all played a role in. Yes, we had some successes, we had some failures, and yet I think it's important to know what happened, because we know that in the past it could happen in an animal wet market, but we need to understand now it could happen in a lab.
This is like the worst possible thing, that an experiment gone wrong could have killed 7 to 20 million people. No one in charge wants to be seen as being responsible for that at all.
I've been investigating and reporting on COVID since it first shook the world in early 2020. It's been quite the journey. Once a conspiracy, now a laboratory origin of COVID-19 is a serious hypothesis that leading intelligence agencies and scientists believe started the pandemic. More evidence now points to the Wuhan Institute of Virology as the source of the outbreak than any other origin. It's only taken a book, a documentary, and dozens of articles to uncover the crucial evidence. Mr. President, welcome. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
In 2021, in the first installment of this documentary, I spoke with former President Donald Trump. He was under no illusion as to the origins of COVID-19. You've seen all of the intelligence. When do you think the virus first started?
Well, some of the intelligence is classified, and I can't talk about it, but common sense tells you it most likely, and when I say most likely, like 95% came from the Wuhan lab. I don't know if they had bad thoughts or whether it was gross incompetence, but one way or the other, it came out of Wuhan, and it came from the Wuhan lab.
Back then, I also spoke with Mike Pompeo, former US Secretary of State and former head of the CIA. He was adamant all evidence pointed to the Wuhan lab.
There was an enormous, albeit indirect, evidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the center point for this. Remember, too, there were 14 American diplomats on the ground in Wuhan at this time who were watching and observing what was taking place inside of Wuhan. I hope one day that we'll be able to get that information out more broadly, but as I come back to it, the cumulative evidence that one can see points singularly to the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
在过去的30多年里，新发和突发传染病在全球范围内呈现出。
The Wuhan Institute has the world's largest collection of bat coronaviruses. Inside the secretive laboratory, scientists were conducting risky research to make viruses more infectious to humans.
They were sampling bats to see whether or not these bats had viruses that looked like SARS or were SARS-like, to see whether there would be the risk or the transmission from a bat to an intermediate host to potentially a human.
Very risky research.
It certainly is, particularly if you did it under the conditions as we understood it.
The US was funding research in Wuhan via an American group, EcoHealth Alliance. The extent of their risky research came to light in this proposal the Wuhan Institute of Virology and their American partners drew up in search of funding. They were experimenting with the parts of COVID-19 that scientists find so unusual. It's what makes the virus so infectious to humans. This proposal was leaked by a whistleblower. Why do many scientists consider this grant proposal a blueprint for SARS-CoV-2?
The diffuse proposal really provides step-by-step instructions for how a scientist might create SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19.
Justin Kinney is an associate professor at New York's Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. His lab is at the forefront of data-driven research into the virus that causes COVID-19.
To me and many other scientists, the diffuse proposal is the smoking gun. This is not something you would get from just any virology lab working on coronaviruses. This is a very specific blueprint for making SARS-CoV-2. The fact that researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology explicitly proposed constructing viruses that would have all the key hallmarks of SARS-CoV-2 is just a remarkable coincidence, if in fact it is a coincidence.
Those researchers include Bat Lady Shizheng Li and her colleague Ben Hu, who many consider to be patient zero. Is he patient zero, Ben Hu?
I would say that a researcher working on novel SARS-like coronaviruses from natural bat populations and genetically engineering them to be more dangerous in humans would be a prime candidate for patient zero. So that, combined with reports that he and others at the Wuhan Institute of Virology came down with COVID-like symptoms very early on, before the outbreak at the Huanan seafood market, to me, it is strong circumstantial evidence that Ben Hu might be patient zero.
What Mike Pompeo and I put out is, people became sick at the lab in October and with symptoms that became entirely consistent with what most people have experienced around the world from COVID-19.
Do you believe that to be the first cluster of the pandemic?
Based on everything I've seen, this is the first cluster.
Mike Pompeo believes Ben Hu and his colleagues were the first patients of the entire pandemic. His knowledge of COVID-19 was second to none in the Trump administration.
I've seen no evidence that there's a cluster that began any place but this. I am all ears to see of any evidence that presents some back set to the contrary.
The suggestion is Ben Hu fell sick from the very viruses he was working on. He denies it, but we know he was hospitalized because of classified intelligence. It was a world exclusive I first broke back in March 2021. It was Thomas DiNanno's team that made this crucial find, that the first known cases of COVID-19 were coronavirus researchers in the Wuhan lab. What intelligence did you uncover?
Well, in a nutshell, Sharri, we had found information that, first of all, the date was highly significant. It had put sick researchers in the Chinese government that we now know were on the US government payroll. I did not know that at the time. Had fallen ill with COVID-like symptoms in the late fall. These were researchers we knew from the information were doing gain-of-function research.
Gain-of-function research, put simply, is genetically manipulating a virus to give it new functions, like the ability to infect humans or become airborne. And that's what was happening inside the Wuhan lab. Justin Kinney believes it's likely the Wuhan scientists had already started their risky research described in the leaked proposal.
Oftentimes, the scientists have done a substantial fraction of the research that they propose. Sometimes they've even done all of the research that they proposed. So, in particular, if you're a scientist and you think that a certain research program is worth pursuing, you just do it. You don't wait until you have specific funding for that.
This is what they were working on before the outbreak. US agencies have been fighting tooth and nail to keep their files under wraps. But these documents obtained under Freedom of Information show that Anthony Fauci's agency had been funding the Wuhan lab and Ben Hu's research for years. One project called Understanding the Risk of Bat Coronavirus Emergence. It's why Fauci, in the earliest days of the pandemic, seemed to be panicking. This is an excerpt from an email Fauci sent to his deputy, Dr. Hugh Auchincloss. He wrote, "It is essential we speak this morning. Read this paper as well as the email. You have tasks today that must be done." The paper Fauci was referring to was 2015 gain-of-function research, which was funded by the National Institute of Health. In response, Auchincloss replied,
"The paper you sent me says the experiments were performed before the gain-of-function pause, but have since been reviewed and approved by NIH. Not sure what that means."
Fauci was clearly concerned in the very earliest days of the outbreak that his agency had funded gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He then assembled a group of the world's leading scientists to examine the origin of the virus. Thanks to a US congressional subpoena, hundreds of emails and Slack messages between Fauci and those scientists have recently come to light. Here's one of the earliest emails from Professor Christian Andersen to Anthony Fauci.
The unusual features of the virus make up a really small part of the genome, so one has to look really closely at all of the sequences to see that some of the features look potentially engineered.
Look potentially engineered. Andersen's email suggests his deep concern about the virus's origin.
After discussions earlier today, Eddie, Bob, Mike and myself all find the genome inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory.
Privately, a lab leak was a real possibility, but publicly, the scientists later described it as a conspiracy. The emails and Slack messages went back and forth as the scientists swapped ideas and shared their suspicions. Their greatest concern, that the new coronavirus might actually be the result of risky lab research.
The lab escape version is so freaking likely to have happened because they were already doing this type of work and the molecular data is fully consistent with that scenario.
That was Professor Christian Andersen again, and the messages go on, and soon it gets political. The scientists start worrying about China and the potential fallout.
Given the shit show that would happen if anyone serious accused the Chinese of even accidental release, my feeling is we should say that given there is no evidence of a specifically engineered virus, we cannot possibly distinguish between natural evolution and escape. So we are content with ascribing it to natural process.
Andersen then replied,
Yep, I totally agree that that's a very reasonable conclusion. Although I hate it when politics is injected into science. But it's impossible not to, given the circumstances.
The scientists published their findings in the prestigious journal Nature Medicine. Their proximal origins paper quickly became gospel. They claimed they were following the usual process of science, that they initially suspected it was a lab leak, but then came to believe the virus was natural. The flaw in their argument is that 2 months after they submitted their paper, they were still discussing whether COVID was genetically engineered. Here is another author, Professor Eddie Holmes from the University of Sydney, in one of the private Slack discussions.
Let's face it, unless there's a whistleblower from the WIV who's going to defect and live in the West under a new identity, we are never going to know what happened in that lab. Never.
My view of the paper is that it's invalidated. I've read the Slack messages. I don't see how that paper can hold any merit one way or the other. So this was clearly to me an orchestrated effort to put out a certain narrative, and the narrative took.
There have been a lot of developments in the investigation to the origins of COVID-19. What do you think has been most significant in the past 2 years?
Well, I think what's been most significant is to discover that a legitimate scientific debate about the origins of COVID was actually actively suppressed, really around the world.
Sir Richard Dearlove is the former head of the British spy agency MI6. He says stifling of the debate around the origins of COVID was led by Anthony Fauci.
We've now, through FOI, Freedom of Information, got a pretty clear idea of what meetings took place, what happened. They put forward one side of the argument, which they, for reasons I don't fully understand, decided to support, and made absolutely sure that the opposite view was not given any oxygen or media publicity.
Instead of disclosing the scientists' secret suspicions, Anthony Fauci diverted attention away from the lab leak theory.
Dr. Fauci, could you address these suggestions or concerns that this virus was somehow man-made, possibly came out of a laboratory in China? You studied this virus. What are the prospects of that?
There was a study recently that we can make available to you where a group of highly qualified evolutionary virologists looked at the sequences there and the sequences in bats as they evolve, and the mutations that it took to get to the point where it is now is totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human.
I watched what was happening in the public domain, and I listened to folks like Dr. Anthony Fauci, and what he said was that the mutations of the virus were totally consistent with a jump from animals to humans.
John Ratcliffe was the United States Director of National Intelligence, the head of 18 different agencies.
What I found was that there wasn't any intelligence that supported that, nor was there any scientific data that we could find.
In a world exclusive, an insider reveals private discussions he had with Anthony Fauci where they deliberately decided to downplay the lab leak theory. Dr. Robert Kadlec was a high-ranking official in the US government's Preparedness and Response Department. He reported directly to the president, and he was also technically Fauci's superior. Here, for the first time, he opens up on camera.
The key is not to let the story die, because there are people who would like it to kind of go away. It's really important to kind of keep people focused on it, and I think there has to be accountability across the board.
What discussions did you have with Anthony Fauci and others behind the scenes about deliberately deciding to turn down the temperature on a lab leak?
Well, it was early on in the event when I did have the conversation with Dr. Collins and Dr. Fauci. It was the intent then to get the White House involved. What we were trying to do was trying to make sure that politically that you would not get into a situation where people would make accusations or allegations, but quite honestly what happened was the exact opposite.
You and Fauci in those discussions just wanted to turn the rhetoric down, is that?
Correct, that was it.
Kadlec says Fauci was worried about protecting his own reputation, and that could be why he diverted attention away from the lab leak.
That would be a natural reaction of him or anybody, particularly, I think for him, to saying, what could this do to me and to our institute as a consequence if we were found to have some culpability or some involvement in this? And I think what probably made that even more acute was the fact that they didn't have good visibility into what they were doing and what they were supporting through the grants, through EcoHealth Alliance that went to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I think that just probably magnified that concern.
It's pretty extraordinary to reveal the conversations that you had with Fauci and Collins. It's pretty extraordinary to publicly say that you did try to downplay the rhetoric around a bioweapon and a lab leak. Are you doing this interview in part because you feel guilty about that?
I just feel like it's an obligation that I have to kind of say what happened. And I think to factually try to portray this, not to get sympathy or forgiveness, but more to saying factually, here's what happened. This is what we tried to do. Did it work? No.
There were scientists in the US intelligence agencies who were highly skeptical of the flimsy proximal origins paper that Fauci was promoting. Analysts at the National Center for Medical Intelligence came to the opposite conclusion. They believed the virus was more likely than not created in a lab. But they were censored and silenced. Confidential sources tell me their input was removed from US President Joe Biden's COVID origins probe.
I read their paper where they made their argument, which was unclassified. They believed, based on their professional judgment, that this well could have been a product of reverse genetics and may have been a deliberately made construct.
Would it surprise you to learn, Sir Richard, that there were highly qualified scientists in intelligence agencies like the Defense Intelligence Agency who did the same sort of work, who came to the same conclusion that SARS-CoV-2 was most likely genetically engineered, and yet they were silenced?
One has to conclude that they were not allowed to speak up, and it's clear where the balance of the evidence lies.
Clearly, from the get-go, even when the Trump administration was still in office, the DNI was pushing out this notion. It was a natural phenomenon. It was only a natural phenomenon, where we now know that they had their own doubts.
In explosive new allegations, a whistleblower has come forward to claim that CIA analysts who favoured the lab leak theory were bribed to change their position. The reason? To take the focus off China and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Over at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Adrian Keane, who's in charge of global health security, was also understood to be pushing the natural origin narrative. We can now exclusively reveal that in a clear conflict of interest, she has a history working with the World Health Organization.
I had found out that apparently she was an outside advisor also to the World Health Organization. They are a political agency, they're a UN agency. It's just not appropriate to do work for a foreign power, and that would include the United Nations. She was, I believe, an advocate for zoonosis, but she was very involved in discrediting the information that we were trying to present to the Secretary of State.
Adrian Keane and the ODNI, the peak intelligence body in the US, didn't answer my questions about whether Keane had disclosed this conflict of interest. Instead, they sent this statement, saying they'd complied with all of the intelligence community's analytic standards, including objectivity. Former director of the ODNI, John Ratcliffe, says there's a very strong assessment that this was a lab leak.
Well, listen, the people that had access to the most intelligence, including myself and Secretary Pompeo, are telling you that the most likely origin of COVID-19, of the Wuhan virus, was a lab leak at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So all of the people that had access to the most data, the most intelligence, will all tell you the same thing, that this is really most likely what happened. And it's more than just a possibility, it's certainly a probability, and it's probably a certainty.
Perhaps one reason they're so adamant is because of a crucial witness the FBI has been cultivating over the past 2 years. It's a close relative of a Chinese military scientist who worked with the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
He's published almost 60 papers just on his study of SARS, and he was a professional vaccinologist, meaning is that his study was focused on vaccines.
His name, Dr. Zhou Yusen.
One of the things that we recognized very early in our study of this was he was one of the first individuals to publish a patent for a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine.
So where does that take the time frame back to? Where would Zhou Yusen have had to start working on his vaccine for COVID-19?
No later than October of 2019. That's what our assessment is, and it's based on the fact that to do what he was trying to do, that's about the time that he had to start. And interesting enough, he published papers that describe the process that he used to do that.
Dr. Zhou Yusen is thought to have begun working on a vaccine for SARS-CoV-2 no later than October 2019. In a mysterious turn of events, just months after this crucial discovery, he was found dead. Intelligence agencies suspect foul play.
What do you think about this statement? Zhou Yusen may have been killed by the People's Liberation Army for accidentally starting COVID-19.
It's certainly possible. We considered that as a plausible possibility. However, we had no evidence to make that assessment.
The Proximal Origins authors have been approached for comment and to appear on this program. As yet, no response. Eddie Holmes has stated that accusations of a cover-up by the scientific community are wrong, misleading, and suggest a lack of understanding of scientific concepts, process, and rigor. He also claims that mounting scientific evidence makes it clear that a lab leak is an unsubstantiated allegation. Eddie Holmes says he stands by the conclusions made in the Proximal Origins paper. As COVID-19 comes and goes, there's still no formal investigation into the origin of the virus and no cooperation from China or US agencies. The cover-up continues.
The problem with all of this is we've made no meaningful changes to prevent it from happening again, either a zoonosis or a lab leak. As a result, we're just as vulnerable as we were 3 years ago to a pandemic.